You ever get one of those letters, so smug it feels like it was scented with superiority and sealed with a wink? Mine showed up in a cream-colored envelope like it was auditioning for a wedding invitation, but inside was a declaration of war. "Welcome to Silverwood Heights," it said, like I'd just voluntarily joined a country club run by control freaks with rulers. I hadn't. What I had done was inherit my grandfather's ranch, 15 acres of quiet pasture, a century-old barn, and a spring so old the land used to whisper around it. 3 days in, the HOA came rolling up my gravel drive in an SUV that cost more than my truck, driven by a woman with designer sunglasses and a clipboard that probably had its own zip code. "Mr. Cole, I'm Camilla Royce, HOA president," she said, like that title meant something outside of her manicured cul-de-sac. What she didn't know, what made this moment fun in retrospect, was that I work in land management. I wrote half the regulations she was about to weaponize against me. But back then, I just smiled, took the welcome binder she handed me like it was radioactive, and said nothing. Because sometimes silence is just the sound of strategy starting. I'm about to give them a master class in what real power looks like. Drop a comment about the most absurd HOA rule you've encountered, because I guarantee what these clipboard warriors don't know about me is about to demolish their perfectly manicured world. Grab your popcorn, folks. This revenge story gets deliciously messy. Now, my name's Marshall Cole. I'm not the loudest guy in the room. I don't argue with cashiers or write angry Yelp reviews. I like fences that don't need repainting, coffee that doesn't talk back, and people who mind their own landscaping. I work behind a desk at the county zoning office, the kind of job that involves more ink cartridges than conversations. I process permits, track land grants, and make sure housing developments don't get built on protected wetlands. Quiet job, quiet life. Or at least it was, until I inherited Whispering Rock from my grandfather, Walter Cole, a man whose handshake could crush a lie flat. Walter had spent 40 years fighting off Silverwood Heights, back when it was just a dream cooked up by Camilla's father, a man with a thirst for land and a memory like a grudge. My grandfather never sold an inch. He once said, "Let 'em build their castle, but not on my soil." And then 3 months after he passed, I walked into a welcome letter, a property packet, and Camilla Royce smiling like she'd finally caught the last free-range turkey at Thanksgiving. She claimed the county approved a boundary shift 5 years ago that pulled my grandfather's property into their HOA by natural expansion. I told her the only thing natural about that expansion was the smell. She chuckled like I was joking. I wasn't. Then came the lines. My mailbox was non-compliant. My barn didn't meet architectural aesthetics. My tractor offended their sense of symmetry, and the kicker, my fence, built before most of her residents had mortgages, apparently violated a visual continuity guideline. That afternoon, a landscaping crew came to dismantle it, just started pulling posts like they were doing me a favor. I walked out in jeans and a flannel, no weapon but a mug of hot black coffee, and said, "You touch one more plank, and I file an injunction." The guy leading the crew looked at me like I'd spoken Latin. I handed him my business card. County Zoning Division. That got his attention. He called Camellia. She showed up again, all perfume and pearls. Tried the soft power route. "Mr. Cole, progress doesn't wait for paperwork." I stared at her and said, "Neither does litigation." That was our first standoff. It wouldn't be the last. That night, I pulled out my grandfather's files. The man had kept records like a librarian with a trust issue. Every letter, map, exemption, permit, notarized and tabbed. One folder, labeled Royce Attempts, read like a war diary. Zoning maps from the 70s showed clear boundaries. A hand-sketched diagram marked Sacred Spring, Cultural Heritage Site, Do Not Touch. Camilla's father had tried to claim water rights back in 1981, lost. Tried again in 94, denied. There were letters from county officials acknowledging the ranch was not, and never would be, part of Silverwood's development plan. And yet here I was, getting fined $75.00 a day for non-conforming fencing. I checked the county system the next morning. The digital map showed my property inside HOA boundaries, but the paper archive still showed the old lines. Someone had rewritten the rules, but only where the public could see, and I had a pretty good idea whose keyboard made the change. I called my colleague Tessa, who manages digital records. I asked if there'd been any recent boundary adjustments pushed through. She hesitated. "Marshall, the system shows the variance was approved in 2018, but there's no hearing log, no council minutes, no signature from the commissioner." I asked her to send me everything. Then I got in my truck and drove to the site that mattered most, the sacred spring. It's not marked on any public trail. You have to know where to step, past the oak my grandfather used to call the witness tree. I stood there for a long time watching the water move like it had secrets to keep. That's when I knew. This wasn't just about fences or mailboxes. This was about legacy, about a piece of land that still had meaning, and about an HOA that didn't realize they'd just picked a fight with a guy who not only knew how to read the playbook, they forgot I helped write it. The next morning, I was restacking firewood behind the shed when I saw Eldon Price trudging up the path with a thermos in one hand and a half-scowl tucked under his ball cap. 76, arthritis in both knees, and still moved with the suspicion of a man who'd been burned by more than just sun. "Camilla's been sniffing around again," he said, without preamble, as if the wind had already told him what the SUV in my driveway meant. I poured us both a mug of coffee, and we sat on the porch swing like two old watchdogs with stiff backs but sharp ears. "She's after the spring," he muttered. "Always has been. Her daddy, too. Tried to buy the rights from your grandfather in '83. Walter said the only way they'd get that spring was if it floated off the mountain and joined the HOA on its own." I cracked a smile, but Eldon wasn't laughing. He pointed toward the tree line. "That oak by the spring? My wife says her people used it for ceremony long before we ever built roads here. It's not just water, son. It's sacred." And right then, I knew we weren't talking about a land dispute anymore. We were talking about erasure, about rewriting history while pretending to prune shrubs. Later that day, I followed the trail down to the sacred oak, same as I had as a boy walking behind my grandfather, listening to him talk about the land like it had moods. The tree looked even older than I remembered, roots like knuckles, bark like it had survived 4 wars. Beside it, the spring burbled up through stone in memory. I took photos, mapped coordinates, and pulled out my grandfather's old topographical charts. And then I did what I do best. I opened a government database and started digging. The problem? There was no trace of the exemption forms Walter had filed. No heritage designation, no water rights defense. Online, it was as if the land had been folded neatly into Silverwood Heights like a poorly photoshopped brochure. But I'd seen the paper files myself. I'd held them in my hands. Somebody had edited reality carefully, quietly, and with a motive sharp enough to pierce through decades of ink. That kind of tampering doesn't just happen. Someone inside had played God with county records. And they weren't done. I called Tessa Lang that evening. Tessa and I had worked side by side at zoning for 10 years. She's the type of person who triple-checks decimal points for fun and once corrected a council member on live radio. When I told her about the missing files, she didn't ask me if I was sure. She just said, "Come in tomorrow morning. I'll pull the backup servers." By noon, we were elbow-deep in metadata and audit logs, cross-referencing changes. "You're not crazy," she whispered, scrolling fast. "The exemptions were there 2 years ago. Look!" She pulled up an archived export. Then, gone. All access logs point to an admin account, one I don't recognize. No username, no staff ID, just a ghost in the system. I asked if that kind of access could be granted externally. She nodded slowly. Only by someone high up, or married to someone who is. The implication hit like a cold slap. Camilla's husband, Greg Royce, served on the county appeals board. He didn't need to break in, he just needed to borrow a login. That wasn't just unethical, that was surgical corruption. And it was far from over. Because just as I was patching holes in the legal wall, the HOA went physical. I came back from the county office to find a trench gouged across my eastern field, 6 feet wide, winding like a scar down the edge of my pasture. A work crew, in matching shirts and blank expressions, told me it was a watershed improvement project. Camilla's voice on speakerphone told a different story. We're optimizing drainage per Silverwood standards. You'll receive your environmental impact fee paperwork soon. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the phone. You mean to tell me you just dug through sovereign property and you're billing me for the mud? But they weren't joking. The fine print hit me the next morning. $4,750.00. Due in 30 days. Or else face a lien. Air rules multiplied like termites, chewing through what little piece I had left. Fines for unpainted trim, for unpermitted gravel, for a bird feeder that didn't meet neighborhood wildlife integration guidelines. I swear they were making them up just to see if I'd flinch. I didn't. I documented everything. Because when bureaucrats play dirty, it's the paper trail that becomes your sword. But make no mistake, this wasn't just a battle over bylaws or drainage ditches. It was an attack on legacy, a quiet war fought in silence and code. They weren't bulldozing my land. They were attempting to erase a story written in root systems and rainfall patterns. Camilla and her clipboard cavalry had underestimated the one thing more dangerous than resistance: a man with access, motive, and nothing left to lose but his patience. When they broke into the land, they didn't just trespass. They provoked every buried root I had. And roots, they don't forget. They grow deeper, they wait, and they know exactly where to push when the earth finally decides to push back. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of quiet, blue sky morning that makes you think the world's finally letting you breathe. I'd just come back from town with a sack of feed and 2 boxes of roofing nails when I saw the trucks lined up like a construction parade gone rogue. County-marked vehicles, hard hats, clipboards. And there in the middle of it, looking like she was hosting a garden party at someone else's funeral, stood "We're implementing emergency safety upgrades," she announced before I could even close my truck door. "Your barn has been flagged as non-compliant and structurally hazardous." Behind her, a worker was already unscrewing the electrical panel mounted to the side of the barn, one we both knew powered not just the lights, but the irrigation system and security feeds. I shouted, "Stop!" But the guy either didn't hear me or didn't care. He tugged at the last bolt, and that's when the sparks flew. Literally. A snap, a sizzle, and then the dry straw near the foundation caught like it had been waiting its whole life for a reason to burn. They say fire is fast, but this wasn't just speed. It was hunger. The flames licked up the walls like they knew exactly where the memories were stored. By the time the hose reached full pressure, the roof had started to sag. I watched through stinging eyes as generations went up in smoke. My great-grandfather's hand-forged tools, my grandmother's letters tied in ribbon, the carved mantelpiece from the first wedding in the family, and worst of all, the ceremonial bundles gifted by local tribal elders, safely kept in the barnstone cellar for decades. History doesn't scream when it burns, but it echoes, and I could feel that echo bounce off my ribs like a slow drumbeat of grief and rage. Camilla backed away, face pale but lips still moving, barking into her phone. The workers scattered like roaches caught in the light. Fire crews arrived, too late to save anything, just in time to confirm I wasn't crazy. Chief McAdams took one look at the power source and said, "That panel didn't short on its own. Not unless someone wired it like a toaster in a bathtub." That wasn't just negligence, that was sabotage. And suddenly, the ash smelled a lot like motive. That night, the barn still smoldering, I sifted through what was left. Smoke had peeled the paint from old stones, melted hinges into metal tears, and warped the earth like it had blistered with sorrow. I didn't expect to find anything, until I saw a glint under a pile of charred wood. a small, fireproof lockbox, partially blackened but intact. My hands shook as I cracked it open. Inside was a brass key and a folded sheet labeled Box 422, First Federal Bank, my grandfather's handwriting, in case they come back. That's the kind of sentence that doesn't need explanation, just action. The next morning, I walked into the bank, still smelling like smoke and spite, and opened the deposit box. What I found inside was quiet power. Records dating back 50 years, letters between Walter and the original county commissioners, blueprints, environmental easements, and tucked near the back, a document with his signature and 4 others establishing the original land grant conditions for Silverwood Heights. I blinked twice. I wasn't just standing on old ranch land. I was standing on the keystone of their entire development. And those conditions? They were due for review in exactly 27 days. I spread everything across my kitchen table that night. The Sacred Spring wasn't just a family story. It was listed in the original development charter as a protected heritage site, with strict buffer zones and public access rights. The land Camilla had so proudly tried to absorb? Exempted from annexation under environmental preservation clauses, unless an owner consented in writing. And Walter never signed. What's more, their current permit was conditional, requiring compliance every 20 years, and guess what? Their clock was about to strike midnight. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because irony shows up in moments where justice peeks through like sunlight under a locked door. They lit the match thinking they'd leave me with ashes. Instead, they revealed the map to their own incineration. You see, people like Camilla think power comes from title and presentation, from clipboards and consensus. But real power? It's buried, archived, passed down in deeds and signatures. And now? I held all of it. The next few days were a haze of insurance claims and official apologies. Sheriff Connors opened an investigation. The fire chief submitted a formal suspicion report. But none of that filled the silence where the barn used to creak in the wind. Every time I walked past the charred beams sticking out like a gravestone, I thought about how much they'd taken and how little they'd thought it would cost them. They expected a fight over paint colors. What they got was a land use expert with every receipt, and a man who didn't need to raise his voice because the laws had already been written, and written in his family's ink. I began documenting every HOA action from day one. Paper trails, email logs, every fine, every inspection, every foot of illegally dug trench. Because if they wanted a war, I was going to show them what one looked like with proper footnotes. The moment they burned that barn, they crossed a line they didn't know existed. And by the time they realize it, the ink will already be dry. They thought they'd buried me under fire codes and fines. Turns out I was holding the matchbook the whole time. After the fire, something in me shifted. Up until then, I'd been responding, plugging leaks, answering threats, parrying the HOA's slow-motion ambush. But when the ashes cooled and I saw what was still left in my hands, permits, proofs, original development terms, I realized I didn't have to play defense anymore. I had the kind of leverage that didn't shout. It whispered, and whispered facts leave longer scars than angry ones. That's when I noticed the black discs tucked discreetly into the drainage grates and fence posts. Surveillance equipment. Camilla had eyes on me. But what she didn't know, bless her HO11 heart, was that I recognized the make and model. They were basic motion-activated cameras, wireless, cheap but useful, if you weren't the kind of guy who had once trained zoning officers on legal perimeter security. So I bought 6 of my own. Smaller, sharper, invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for, and slid them into the same access points. Now I wasn't just being watched, I was watching the watchers. And in a world ruled by paperwork and whispers, that's how you start reclaiming the truth. The first thing I caught was Rick Jansen, a so-called security coordinator, visiting the drainage trench with another man I didn't recognize. Rick had the kind of face that used to belong to beat cops in towns too small for bad news. Square-jawed, calm, and always pretending to be somewhere else. But on camera, Rick was different. Leaning against his SUV, arms crossed, he muttered, "This is getting out of hand. The guy's not folding. Camilla wants him out before the renewal date." The other man, nervous, nodded like he wanted to nod his way out of responsibility. Then Rick added something that made my spine cold. "The condemnation hearing's already set. Once that hits, he's boxed in. Won't matter if the fire was accidental or not." That word, boxed, hit like a shovel to the gut. I'd buried family in boxes. Now they were planning to put my land in one. But at least now I had voices to match the shadows, and those voices were going to be the undoing of every fine they'd stapled to my gate. And didn't wait. I called Ivy Chen, a regional journalist I'd crossed paths with years ago during an environmental dispute hearing. Ivy was the rare kind of reporter who read zoning language like some people read poetry, and asked better questions than most lawyers. I met her at a diner halfway to the city and laid it all out. The boundary manipulation, the water rights fight, the surveillance footage, the fire. She listened in silence, scribbling notes, occasionally stopping to ask things like, "Are you absolutely sure her husband chairs the appeals board?" I nodded. "And her HOA's permit expires in, 23 days? I tapped the table. "Exactly," she closed her notepad. "I'm not running anything yet. But if what you're saying checks out, this isn't just a zoning story, it's fraud, corruption, maybe even conspiracy." That same week, I sat with Silas Merritt, retired county judge, and the only HOA member who'd ever questioned Camilla to her face. At 81, he had the patience of a monk and the memory of a chess master. He read the documents I'd gathered, then leaned back and said, "You've got a case. But more than that, you've got a cause. These people have turned community into currency. Time to make it cost them." That's when the unexpected gift landed in my inbox. Anonymous at first, but later traced to Tamara Phillips, Gregory's wife, the HOA enforcer's better half. Inside the folder, internal emails, meeting minutes, strategy memos. Tamara included a short message. "I didn't know until they cut down the tree. My daughter cried for 2 days. She's part Cherokee." That oak meant something to her. The emails were damning. Camilla referencing removal of non-compliant emotional assets. Gregory joking about how convenient a fire would be if the barn continued to delay progress. Even an email string suggesting which code violations to target for maximum pressure. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were manufacturing a siege. But now? Now I had evidence. I had motive. And thanks to Tamara, I had their playbook. I started building timelines, connecting names, cross-referencing dates with surveillance footage and permit records. If they wanted a quiet exit, they should have picked a quieter victim. But instead, they chose a man raised by a rancher, trained in land code and fueled by the smell of burned cedar and broken trust. Eldon Price came through too. Turns out the old man had a drone he used to track deer paths on the edge of Silverwood land. And one clip, dated just a week earlier, showed Camilla leading a group of investors through the field north of the sacred spring, land she had no legal title to touch. "This," Eldon said, handing me the footage, "is her trying to sell what she doesn't own." Sure enough, Camilla waved her arms like she was unveiling a sculpture. "We're breaking ground right here," she said, crystal clear on audio. "The heritage site will be relocated. The HOA board has already drafted the statement." Heritage site? Relocated? That was like saying you're going to move a mountain because it's inconvenient. And those investors? They were smiling like they'd just discovered a discount on stolen gold. They weren't just trespassing. They were selling land that didn't legally belong to them, and they were halfway through the deal. They weren't just on stolen land, they were halfway through selling it to people who didn't know the deed was forged. You know you're in trouble when the letter arrives by certified mail and smells like cologne and consequences. It was thick, legal, glossy, and worded like a Hallmark card written by a snake. Notice of condemnation proceedings, it read, citing significant structural damage, abandonment indicators, and my personal favorite, environmental neglect. That last one was bold, considering they'd dug the trench and lit the fire. Apparently, if you torch a man's barn and blockade his driveway long enough, you can legally accuse him of not living there. I sat on my porch, holding that paper like it was radioactive, and let the weight of their strategy settle in. Camilla Royce hadn't just overstepped. She was trying to bury me in bureaucracy. But this time, I didn't call my lawyer. I called the press. And I called every neighbor who still remembered my grandfather's name. The hearing was held in the county building's main chamber, which hadn't seen this much foot traffic since the 4th of July bake-off scandal of '09. The room buzzed with a kind of civic electricity, part justice, part gossip, part popcorn-fueled rage. Camilla entered, wearing her signature soft pink blazer like it was armor, trailed by Gregory and 2 lawyers who looked like they practiced aggressive yoga. She gave me a pitying smile, the kind you save for people standing on the wrong side of history. "Mr. Cole," the moderator began, "we're here to determine whether your property has been improperly maintained to the extent that it presents a risk to the surrounding community." I stood, calm, with a stack of files under one arm and a flash drive in my pocket that weighed more than guilt. "I believe," I said, "we are not here to discuss neglect, but to expose intent." Well, that's when the temperature dropped. I began with photos, images of the surveillance devices hidden in my drainage trench, their serial numbers and the timestamps of each retrieval. I played audio from Rick Jansen discussing the timeline for getting me out. I showed satellite overlays of the illegal trench work, dated 1 day before the fake watershed notice. Then I pulled out the gem. Emails leaked by Tamara Phillips, where Camilla and Gregory discussed removal by escalation and joked about the barn being too flammable for its own good. The room went silent in a way only truth can command. Then I handed over signed affidavits, Tessa's confirmation that zoning records had been scrubbed, Silas Merritt's review of the forged boundary maps, and Ivy Chen's preliminary findings for the exposé going live that evening. Judge Silas, seated quietly in the back, stood and cleared his throat. "In light of this evidence," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight like a gavel, "I formally request a full financial and legal audit of Silverwood Heights Homeowners Association." The crowd didn't cheer, but they didn't need to. The sound of Camilla's throat tightening was applause enough. From there, things unraveled fast. Investors who had been waiting in the wings to fund Silverwood's expansion began slipping out of the room like bad actors exiting a failed dress rehearsal. Someone from the back shouted, "You tried to build a clubhouse on sacred land." And suddenly, half the room was on their feet, murmuring, pointing, filming. Reporters had arrived, some local, some from regional affiliates, feeding off the scent of scandal like flies to warm garbage. Ivy Chen's article hit the wire halfway through the hearing, titled, "Zoning Zealots or Land Thieves Inside the Silverwood Scandal?" And within minutes my phone buzzed with notifications. Safe Whispering Rock was trending. Camilla's expression curdled slowly as the walls of plausible deniability collapsed around her heels. The commissioner called for silence. "We are suspending all condemnation activity pending further investigation. Additionally, Silverwood Heights land grant renewal is hereby frozen, effective immediately." And there it was. They wanted my barn gone so badly. Funny how their entire foundation caught fire with it. Gregory leaned in to whisper something to Camilla, but she didn't respond, her hands clenched into little diplomatic fists on the table. One of the investors she'd given the unauthorized spring tour to was now on the phone in the hallway, pacing like a man watching his retirement go up in smoke. And just when I thought the day couldn't squeeze any more poetry into its irony, Sheriff Connors entered from the back and walked directly to the front row. "We've received additional footage," he announced, "and a complaint regarding property damage, privacy violations, and potential zoning fraud. We'll be coordinating with the district attorney." Camilla finally turned to look at me. And I gave her the same polite, quiet nod she gave me months ago, only now the clipboard was in my hand. The court called a recess, Camilla called her lawyer, and the sheriff, he called the feds. You ever see Justice walk into a room wearing handcuffs? It's quieter than you think, less fireworks, more paperwork. Camilla Royce was arrested outside the Silverwood clubhouse, still in her blush pink blazer and oversized sunglasses, as if denial could be worn like armor. Gregory wasn't far behind, escorted out of a county board meeting mid-sentence, his tie flapping like a white flag that came too late. Charges ranged from zoning fraud to conspiracy to commit property destruction. The mayor, who'd brushed off every complaint with the grace of a used car salesman, quietly resigned 3 days later, citing health concerns. Funny how the body gives out when the heat turns up. And just like that, the HOA's circle of protection cracked like thin ice under real weight. Former board members lined up to testify. Turns out loyalty doesn't run deep when your signature's on falsified documents. Watching them fold one by one wasn't about revenge. It was about gravity, finally working as advertised. With the courthouse circus behind me, I turned my attention to something bigger than payback: legacy. I called a meeting under the oak tree, the one that had stood witness to it all. Eldon showed up, so did Ivy, Tessa, Judge Silas, and a dozen neighbors who'd once kept their heads down when the HOA came knocking. I laid out a new idea: a community cooperative, rooted in stewardship instead of surveillance. No fines, no clipboard tyrants, just shared responsibility for the land, its history, and its future. Silverwood tried to control this place with regulations, I told them. We can protect it with relationships. The silence that followed wasn't doubt. It was agreement settling in like morning dew. That night, Ivy published the follow-up piece. From burned barn to blueprint, how one man redrew the line. And the next day, the developers, yes, the same ones who once nearly broke ground on sacred land, came knocking with a very different offer. Hudson and Brooks, the firm that had backed Camilla's expansion dream, now pitched a sustainable land education initiative. No golf course, no clubhouse. Instead, a partnership to fund an open-air conservation center and public heritage trail designed to preserve the spring, honor indigenous roots, and teach local zoning students how not to get bamboozled by a forged permit. We were misled, their lead rep said, but your grandfather's vision of balanced development, it's actually marketable now. I stared at him for a beat. You mean it's finally popular to have a conscience? He chuckled awkwardly, but to his credit, the deal included full restoration of the spring's buffer zone and funding for a new barn. The barn went up with help from neighbors. Wood donated, hands volunteered, coffee brewed in vats. It wasn't just a rebuild, it was a resurrection. And beside it, still standing proud, was the sacred oak. We posted a sign at its base, written in both English and the tribal dialect. Some roots were never meant to be moved. That fall, I accepted a new role, environmental oversight lead for the county. Same desk, bigger pen. My first action? Overhaul conditional land grant compliance, starting with random audits and public tracking. No more backdoor deals, no more digital magic tricks, and no more assuming a fancy brochure equals legal authority. The county commission passed the reforms unanimously. Public opinion tends to get loud after a scandal, and mine was still echoing. Then came something I never expected. A call from State Assemblywoman Langford. We've drafted a bill inspired by your case, she said. It's called the Cole Act. Strengthens homeowner rights, requires transparent notice of zoning changes, mandates third-party audit for HOA governance. I didn't say anything at first, just stared out at the pasture, watching the sunlight roll across the hills like a slow blessing. That's not my name, I said finally. It's my grandfather's, but he'd be proud. The law passed 2 months later. Not flashy, just strong, like a well-poured fence post. And on the first warm Saturday of spring, I planted an apple tree beside the new barn. Same soil, Same roots, grown from a cutting of my grandfather's old orchard, the one he'd kept alive through frost, fire, and HOA harassment long before hashtags existed. I dug the hole, slow, patted the dirt firm, and watched as neighbors gathered behind me with tools, smiles, and stories. One by one they added flowers, bricks, a community reborn, not through control but connection. They came for a piece of land. What they didn't know was I came with roots. As I stood under that oak, dirt on my palms and sunlight breaking through the leaves, I realized something simple but powerful. They had tried to turn my story into a cautionary tale, but I rewrote it as a blueprint for standing your ground. This land didn't just survive. It remembered, and so did I. See, some people use rules to trap others. Folks like Camilla build fences to keep control, but people like my grandfather, they planted trees that outlast paper, signatures, and threats. They didn't fight with fists, they fought with roots. And in the end, that's what saved us. Legacy beats tyranny when you know where to dig. If this story hit you somewhere real, if you've ever felt bulldozed by bureaucracy or underestimated by someone with a clipboard, then let us know in the comments. I want to hear your stories too. Hit that like button if you believe property rights and common sense still matter, and don't forget to subscribe because we've got more stories just like this. True, powerful, and waiting to be told. The next episode, let's just say the HOA, again, didn't know.